So, welcome everybody to this webinar on accelerating transformation with positive food system tipping points. My name is Tom Powell. I'm an Oppenheimer Research Impact Fellow at the Global Systems Institute in the University of Exeter. And I'll be moderating today's session where we have two fantastic speakers, Franziska Gaupp from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research at PIC and Sol Kislig from the University of Bern. Both Franzi and Sol were co-authors on the food systems chapter in the Global Tipping Points report, which was published last autumn around COP, where a focus on food systems featured alongside positive tipping points in many other high-emitting sectors. And I hope someone can maybe put the link to that report in the chat if necessary. But before I hand over to Franzi and Sol, they asked me to just put this session on food systems tipping points in a little bit of context for the broader Tipping Points webinar series that many of you may have come to some previous events, and you may have participated in the Tipping Towards Positive Social Change seminar, where you heard that 70% of all emissions can be related to behavioural and lifestyle changes. And we considered a whole range of different kinds of social tipping interventions, from energy production to how we build cities, or education about climate to how we make decisions about transport and so on. And today we want to take a real focus on interventions in the food system to add them to that list. And I think Sol and Franzi will explain why that's so important, that the food system plays a big role here. And in another previous webinar about norms, agency, and scales, you'll have heard about how organizing ourselves in groups and social networks increases our problem-solving capacities, and that we need not only technological change, but to reinforce and to drive that with social change. And today we really want to hear from Sol and Franzi and then explore collectively how individual and collective agency can play a role in food systems transformation. And with that focus on agency, and particularly personal agency, I know Franzi and Sol were very keen to trial a slightly new format for this webinar series and make it a little bit more participatory. So we will be doing some breakouts at groups and so on a little bit later in the session. And I hope you'll bear with us if there are a couple of moments where we have to change between slightly different formats. And we'll try to get the technology right, but bear with us if there are one or two pauses. There is a Q&A session. We're going to hear from Franzi and Sol, and there will be a Q&A session. To find the Q&A box where you can post your questions, you may need to click on the three dots at the bottom of your screen and click the Q&A option. Please submit any questions in there, and we'll keep track of them and put them to our speakers after we've heard from them. And with that, I'll hand over to Franziska to start. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. And when I think about food, I think right now about the delicious asparagus and the rhubarb that are in season right now here in Germany. But I also think about farmers' protests that have happened across Europe over the past months. And so I think before we deep dive into our talk today, it might be worth to think about what the food system actually is. How exactly is it defined? How does it look like? And Sol, I think you and your team have made this really nice graph about the food system. Maybe you want to talk about that quickly, and I'll put up a slide for you.
Hi, Franzi, and thanks, Tom, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here as well. And yes, we actually asked ourselves that question as well. What actually is the food system, and which parts does it compile of? And based on the HLPE definition, the high-level panel of experts definition, we've developed this visualization of the food system. The definition goes as follows. A food system gathers all the elements, meaning environment, people, inputs, processes, infrastructures, institutions, and activities that relate to the production, processing, distribution, preparation, and consumption of food, as well as the output of these activities, including socioeconomic and environmental outcomes. So what is really important here is to show that this is a systemic perspective on the food system. It's aimed to be very holistic. So food is not only eating or producing food, it's all dimensions and steps along the value chain, which are closely interlinked and optimally form this cycle. Let's play through quickly with an example. So say a chickpea is being grown as a natural resource. It's being grown on a field, then it goes into agriculture, into production. It's being harvested and it's transported to a processing facility where it's processed, packaged, made, for example, into hummus, stored, transported, and then ends up in retail and trade, where it's traded and marketed, and then eventually can be bought and consumed by consumers. It then gets digested, or in the worst case, wasted, which optimally can be utilized, disposed, and recycling, eventually closing the cycle back to natural resources. So not surprisingly, we also see here the 3 dimensions of sustainability. So the ecological dimension, the economic dimension, and the social dimensions. And in line with that, we define a sustainable food system as a system that is in line with, that ensures food security today without endangering social, economic, or ecological foundations for future generations. So as previously mentioned, you can see that this graph aims to visualize how interlinked the different sectors and subsystems are. And I believe that you, Franziska, have developed a graph that looks specifically at this systemic interconnections, haven't you?
Yeah, thanks, Sal. Exactly. And I would like to move forward. Yes, the slide that works. So I looked in a paper, I looked at the food system through the systemic risk lens. And similar to you and your group, I define the food system as a system of systems. So as you have shown already, it's an economic system. It's like the part of the social system, a part of the food system, financial system, biophysical system, etc., etc. And it's also a complex and uncertain system. And the characteristics of this complex system that I have defined here for this paper are, for example, nonlinear dynamics. We have sometimes feedback loops. We have also tipping points and cascading events, but we also have like sometimes unintended and unforeseen consequences or ignored links. And to make those interlinkages and systemic risk a little bit more visible, I also use an example. Let's start, for example, with compound events. Let's imagine we have crop failures in parallel in different so-called bread baskets across the globe. So that's part of the biophysical system. And that swaps over then into the economic system, because if we have crop losses, large crop losses, the prices are rising and food price spikes might then swap over to the social system and lead to food insecurity, increased poverty, and hunger. And if you have that over an extended period of time, and your resources and your storage and your resilience is depleted, it might swap over into the political system and lead to food riots and large protests. And one example that's often named here is the Arab Spring. And there are some scholars who actually say that the drought and the food insecurity the years before Arab Spring was a major driver of the political upheaval. Yeah.
So you've shown how these there's different risks. What kind of risks can you see for resource use and environmental impacts of the food system? Why do we need to look at the food system? Why is it interest?
Yeah, so the food system is actually feeding a population of nearly 8 billion people globally today. But as you said, it has considerable impacts on planet and people. And let's look a little bit at the statistics. So 40% of global land, global ice-free land, is actually used for agriculture. And within that, the majority, 80% of it, is actually used for livestock production. So that refers to feed production or grazing land. Also, 70% of freshwater withdrawal on a global scale is used for the agricultural production. And again, a large chunk, 41%, is used for livestock production. Agriculture is also a huge driver of biodiversity loss, of deforestation. It pollutes rivers and lakes. And it is also a major driver, a major emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. And if you look at the entire food system, so really from production over retail to consumption and food loss and waste, studies have now estimated that it accounts for between 34 and 37% of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really a major emitter. Yeah. On the consumption side, the diets that we consume today are also unfortunately largely unhealthy and are not really good for our health. And I just looked up the latest numbers yesterday. In 2022, 43% of adults were overweight and 16% obese. And that's a trend that has been going on for a while, and it's actually increasing. And that also leads to an increase of non-communicable diseases. And a study found that 22% of deaths among adults are actually due to dietary diseases such as cardiovascular disease, cancer, or diabetes. And you see here on the left side, probably a figure that many of you have seen before, the Eat Lancet Commission, the Eat Lancet report from 2019, where they show in orange kind of optimal healthy diet. And then you see what we actually consume on a global scale, and we see that we eat way too much red meat and starchy vegetables, and we don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. And that's linked to my last point. Healthy diets are often not affordable to many people, and that is also really an issue, like this inclusion aspect that we have to think about when we talk about a healthy, inclusive, nature-positive food system. And my last slide here is, let's look into the future, the trend of food demand. And this is a study from my colleague Benjamin Budilski and other colleagues who have projected into the future how the food demand might change. In 2015, we have a projected population of nearly 10 billion people. And the study has estimated that the food demand will increase by approximately 50% compared to 2010. And as you can see here in this graph, red is the animal source food, and animal source food has already between 1965 and 2010 and will further till 2050 increase disproportionately. And that is, of course, linked to economic development, which then leads to a lifestyle change. Many people want to eat a Western diet. And so the study estimates a doubling of animal-sourced food demand in 2050. And that, of course, has then really implications, as we have seen, on health and on the planet.
Well, that all sounds quite discouraging. But is there anything we can do to transform our current food system towards a healthy and environmentally friendly and inclusive system, Franziska?
Yeah, so we actually did look at that. We looked at the topic of food system transformation and have developed this framework in a previous publication. And you see here on the x-axis the timeline from 2020 till 2050, and on the y-axis you see food system indicators. And we can basically decide now and today how we want to move into the future. We have a business as usual scenario with high emissions, high obesity rates, or we have here on the bottom a pathway that we call a food system development pathway, which is a sustainable future. And what we wanted to look or show here in this framework is what are the actual options that we have to intervene and to transform the food system. And we have here on the left side, we have measures and objectives. So that includes technological advances in irrigation systems or dietary change. And then the question is, of course, how do we achieve those objectives? And so we have collected an entire toolbox of policies that you can see here on the right side. That's greenhouse gas taxes. We can subsidize positive things. We can subsidize biodiversity. We can improve food safety regulations. We can also, the interventions include behavioral things like marketing campaigns for healthy consumption. And in addition to all those policies, we also take a look at the political economy aspects. So that refers to why are certain policies successful and why are others not, who has actually the power, and who are the winners and losers of certain policy implementations. And you see now this is really a lot. It's a massive toolbox of interventions. And maybe you lose sight and you think, okay, where do we start? And so you and your team for the Global Tipping Point report, you have actually identified 3 so-called key leverage points, haven't you?
Yes, indeed, we have. We have talked to a lot of experts in the process and read a lot of academic literature and tried to summarize the current status of knowledge. And based on that, the key leverage points in the food system are food loss and waste reduction, dietary shift towards more plant-based diets, and a shift towards regenerative farming practices. So we've tried to summarize the interactions between these three key leverage points in this graph that you can see now, which might look a bit confusing at first glance. So let me quickly walk you through it. We have food loss and waste reduction on the left, which directly leads to improved food security and to a reduction of the land footprint of the food system. This is quite obvious as the less food which is being produced is wasted or lost, so we can more efficiently use the land to grow food, and we need less additional land to be converted into agricultural land. This reduction in land footprint leads to a reduction in land use change emissions and to an increase in terrestrial carbon sinks, which then contribute to climate change mitigation and a reduced pressure on natural ecosystems. For the second key leverage point, dietary shift, we have one step preceding the dietary shift, which we think is very important, namely the improvement of livestock alternatives, which can be plant products, but also meat alternatives or meat substitutes. Dietary shift directly contributes to a reduction in methane emissions, as these mainly stem from the livestock sector. Methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, as most of you might know, and it's an important contributor to mitigating climate change in the short and midterm. And thirdly, by weakening incentives from intensive agriculture, we can encourage a shift to more regenerative agriculture, and this in return can increase carbon sinks and directly improve agroecological health, for example, the soil health. So the main message this graph aims to convey is that the key leverage points can interact to produce a cascade of benefits for natural ecosystems, as well as climate change mitigation and food security. This is important because with the growing risk of reaching environmental Earth system tipping points, and now more than 30 years of inadequate climate action, this means that we don't have the time for to transform human or socio-technical system in a business as usual mentality, but we need to move many times faster. Sorry, you're muted, Franziska. Franziska? Oh,
yes,
yeah.
Sorry, I was on mute. Classic. Yeah. You said we need to move many times faster, but how does that actually look like?
Well, one way to accelerate the speed is the idea to trigger tipping points in social systems as well. So like tipping points in environmental system, a small change in a human socio-technical system at the right point in time can also trigger a nonlinear change. But contrary to negative tipping points in natural system, tipping points in human systems can be positive, normatively positive. They can start from a current human system which is unsustainable, such as the food system is now, and lead it to reach a new qualitatively better state. Such positive tipping points can be defined as a change in a system or subsystem that then becomes self-reinforcing beyond the critical threshold and leads to substantial, frequently abrupt, and often also irreversible impacts. But as compared to Earth system tipping points, these impacts for positive tipping points are predominantly beneficial. We know that the system is close to tipping when it loses its resilience, and its resilience means its ability to recover from disruption, and it becomes increasingly unstable. So now if we do consciously want it to tip, we need to increase this instability by encouraging reinforcing feedbacks. I will get back to that later. There's a framework that we developed in the frame of the Global Tipping Points Report 2023 on how to bring about such positive tipping points in human systems. Let me show it to you. So we have these three phases in the framework. The first one is the enabling phase, the second one is the accelerating phase, and the third one a stabilizing phase. In the enabling phase, we as humans have the opportunity to try to intervene to trigger a tipping point. In the accelerating phase, a change becomes self-propelled through reinforcing feedbacks and takes on a new and non-linear pace. And then in the third phase, the stabilizing phase, the system slows down at a qualitatively different state. During the enabling phase, there are 3 steps or 3 different types of interventions that we can take. One is to create enabling conditions. So many tippable systems, also the food system, need a concerted effort over a long period of time to generate a moment where one input then might trigger this tipping point. So we need to lay the groundwork by creating enabling conditions. Creating these enabling conditions means making the desired change the most affordable, most attractive, most convenient, most accessible, and also morally acceptable option. This can be done by a variety of different interventions, for example, to target a smaller population, as these are more prone to tip, but also by changing social network structures or by the promotion of price and quality parity of more sustainable alternatives. Most research so far, as Tom has pointed out also in the introduction, has focused on interventions in technological and economic domains, but we've come to the conclusion that also political and social behavioral domains are important to encourage positive tipping in human systems. Examples of this could be changing social norms, like an anti-fossil fuel norm, but also changing infrastructure to encourage a change of behavioral norms. A very simple example of that would be to change streets in a way, or to adapt streets in a way to make more space for bikes, to encourage commuting by bike instead of by car. In a second step during the enabling phase, we can increase the reinforcing feedbacks, which I mentioned before, or we can decrease the dampening feedbacks. So reinforcing feedbacks are mathematically positive feedbacks that increase the system instability, and dampening feedbacks are mathematically negative feedbacks which keep a system locked in its current status quo. So an example of a dampening feedback would be a strong incumbent that's lobbying to resist new policies. And thirdly, during the enabling phase, we can attempt to trigger tipping. And tipping, this can be really any phenomenon that could be causally linked to a tipping point. It could be a social innovation, an investment, a policy intervention, or even something incidental, such as a pandemic or a conflict that opens a window of opportunity for the system to tip into a new qualitatively different state. During the acceleration phase, the second phase of the framework, the change becomes nonlinear and is dominated by these reinforcing feedbacks now. We can really see that at point F1, during the enabling phase, the dampening feedbacks are still dominating. This is the orange arrow, and they're still stronger, so they keep the system locked in its current functioning and only slowly allow it to change. And then at point F2, in the accelerating phase, we can really see that the destabilizing feedback has taken overhand and the reinforcing feedback, and there's nonlinear changes happening. Finally, in the stabilizing phase, we have an optimal outcome, hopefully, which is in line with a safer and more just world. But unfortunately, of course, positive tipping can also result in shallower outcomes or even unintended consequences. An example of a shallower outcome would be if vested interests push for a suboptimal tipping point. We could observe that in the natural gas lobby that pushes for hydrogen instead of heat pumps. And then we have a solution that's slightly better than the current status quo, but still not the optimal outcome that could have been reached. Unintended consequences can happen, for example, for a certain region of the world, where in an idea of doing something positive, for example, decarbonizing the transport system and improve storage for electricity, regions that that have lithium and cobalt for batteries were depleted and contaminated. So that has very unintended negative consequences. What am I trying to teach you with this, or what am I trying to say with this? While trying to trigger positive tipping points by intervening consciously in human systems, we should always really be careful and make sure to minimize harm and injustices, because only when we ensure a just transition, we can talk about a normatively positive tipping point. So now that we have theoretically conceptualized these positive tipping points, Franziska, can you try to help me and understand how to apply this concept to the key leverage points that I've mentioned before? Maybe let's start with food loss and waste. What would this look like?
Yeah, happy to go into detail here. So just again, to be aware why food loss and waste is such an important leverage point. A study found or showed that if food loss and waste was a country, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, responsible for 8% of global emissions. So it's really key leverage point if we manage to reduce food loss and waste. And if we apply this lens of social tipping and enabling, accelerating, stabilizing, how would that look like for food loss and waste reduction? We would implement policies to prevent and recycle food loss and waste. There is this example in Japan, the food recycling law, where they forced industries or obliged industries to monitor and report progress about food loss and waste reduction. On the consumption side, a possibility would be food waste awareness campaigns or improved labeling and packaging that makes it easier to buy the right amount and not to buy too much. Then we also have interventions on the production side, and one of them could be true cost accounting, which refers to including all the externalities on health and the environment that our current agricultural production systems entail. And if food became more expensive, we would have fewer food loss and waste. And finally, a technological or a financing intervention could be to finance storage and cold chain, which also would reduce food loss and waste. Accelerating would then be learning by doing. So that could mean, for example, taking other countries as example. So as I said, there was this example in Japan, but also the UK has implemented food loss and waste reduction regulations already. So we could learn from them. And then there's always a social contagion. So if my friends and peers start to recycle and throw away less food, I also might follow them. And lastly, the stabilizing fact is the aim to cut food loss and waste in half by 2030. And that was actually even written down as a SDG 12.3. The key key leverage point is regenerative agricultures. And let me bring in our moderator, Tom, quickly here, because Tom, I think you were responsible for that part in the Global Tipping Point report, weren't you?
Yeah, thanks for giving me an opportunity to speak about my favorite subject. I see I've been editing a different slide deck. Never mind, that's fine. So yeah, as you see at the top there, half of the world's habitable land is used for agriculture. It's just the basis of this food system that Franzi and Sol have been describing. And what that means is half of all land on the planet, which is not rock, ice, or desert, is already farmed. And so, of course, what we do on that land really, really matters. And all of this discussion about food systems transformation, from my perspective, ultimately comes down to what happens on the farms where food is produced and the environmental impacts of those activities. And we can think about this really in the context of what we might describe as a previous tipping point. So the Green Revolution, to some of us, looks like a very deliberate effort to transform the food system that happened in the past, based on models of intensivization of agriculture, which underpin what's called the Great Acceleration, this huge growth in human populations and technical capacity and economies, and everything that's happened in the last since the sort of mid 1950s. But that has come, it's a very good example of what Sol was explaining earlier about tipping points that can have unintended consequences or shallower consequences than they're intended, because that has come at the cost both of huge environmental degradation and also systemic vulnerabilities and inequalities that are very hard now to escape from. So what we're really thinking about here is a kind of second green revolution, or a new way of thinking about what farming is and what farming does, and trying to move away from the idea of farming as a very kind of linear system where we put in inputs to get out outputs, which are essentially dry mass of food, in order to feed a growing population, and really think about it much more as a stewardship of multiple ecosystem services, and place the emphasis on bringing back agroecological health into our food systems and our farming systems. So some ways to enable this, and I'd like to think about, I don't have time to sort of fully develop in two different paths here, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that in farming terms, we're often talking about kind of two parallel systems globally. We have this global intensive industrial system, which is dominated by livestock, production for livestock, as Franzi and Sol explained. But there is simultaneously a very localized food system that feeds about 2 billion people in subsistence and smallholder farming modes, mostly in the global south, which is also really important to consider here. For both of those systems, in fact, a way to enable transformation is to to work out how to either economically or otherwise incentivize diversification of business models and an emphasis on ecosystem service provision. In industrial systems, that might look like using really powerful subsidy levers. So for example, in the EU, more than half of a livestock farmer's income, a cattle farmer's income, comes from subsidy already. Changing the structure of those subsidies is a very powerful lever to incentivize different behaviors, and can have quite rapid effects. And we have a large experiment in the UK now trialing a new subsidy system called the environmental land management schemes, which allows farmers to gain direct payments for improving other ecosystem services. And of course, as in any tipping point, positive tipping point, we need to be trying to substitute that existing status quo system, existing system with a system that is an improvement on the old system. And that means that regenerative practices either have to have lower input costs or higher productivity or perform better in some other way than the existing system, right? So for a smallholder farmer in sub-Saharan Africa, performing better might mean higher productivity. It might also mean being more climate resilient, so that if you've diversified the assets on your farm by planting trees which enable you to keep animals alongside your crop, in a drought year, you can sell the animals and continue to send your daughter to school. And that's a form of climate resilience that really matters in terms of performance to people in those landscapes. And of course, underpinning all of this, the information and the networks and the education on the kinds of farming practices that are available to transition to is absolutely essential. We really underestimate, I think the loss of, as rural landscapes have been depopulated and industrialized, or depopulated in sort of very rapid urbanization trends in the global south, the loss of social networks and means of sharing information about farming has been really powerful, and making sure that information is accessible on new business models, new practices to farmers is crucial. Through the accelerating phase, those information cascades, as well as learning by doing, are absolutely essential. And for farmers, in industrial systems, that includes the very powerful network of farm advisors and consultants and agronomists who have huge influence over what farmers choose to do at any one moment. Network effects through farming communities, but also through consumers. We have real influence as consumers over what we choose to buy, the provenance of what we buy, and can influence markets in that way. And social ecological feedbacks are fundamental. There has to be a tangible improvement in the social outcomes for the farmers and the communities who are eating the food that was produced, and the ecology of a landscape. And like that example in the global south, we can demonstrate in some cases that where farmers adopt regenerative practices, we see sort of wide, like landscape scale regreening, for example, which provides other benefits in terms of mitigating extreme heat, ensuring the soils hold more water, improving biodiversity and pollinator networks, and so on, which all feed back into the agricultural productivity. So there are some very powerful forces, but also some very entrenched sort of vested interests and dampening feedbacks which maintain the status quo. And the actual outcomes, or the sort of the models that are available to transition to, are very context dependent and landscape dependent, which is why I found it difficult to describe a kind of stabilizing phase here. But it's, there are huge opportunities here that are very exciting. And with that, I'll hand back to Sol, I think, or Franzi.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tom, for sharing your expertise on these regenerative agriculture practices and their huge potential to transforming the food system. Moving on to the last key leverage point, the dietary shift. Just to reiterate why such a dietary shift is important, I think we've mentioned it a couple of times now. More than 80% of farmland is used for livestock, but it produces at the same time only 18% of food calories globally and 37% of protein. So it's a highly inefficient way of eating, actually. During the enabling phase of dietary shift, there are different interventions that we can take. As already mentioned in the overview graph of the key leverage points, improved alternatives to animal products are very important in enabling this transition. To get there, we need, for instance, public funding for research and development in this field. And the aim is to get meat substitutes and meat alternatives to taste as well as cost parity, so they can compete with livestock-based products. A further intervention we can take during this enabling phase is transition costs for farmers, or transitioning subsidies for farmers and the food industry, especially because the transitioning costs for farmers in the food industry that earn a living based on livestock farming can be very high, and they need to be supported and taken along on this journey towards a more plant-forward or plant-based food system of production as well as consumption. This can be done, for example, by incentivizations with the reorientation of subsidies, or with the creation of alternative income streams for agriculture, such as agri-photovoltaics or biochar. But most importantly, we need to shift norms and behaviors around eating, especially in high and middle income countries in the global north. Creating the enabling conditions for dietary norm and behavior change in consumers can involve a variety of different but strategically timed and targeted interventions. One such intervention could be policy or procurement choices that increase people's exposure to livestock alternatives. This has been shown to be really effective, for example, by a study by Garnett et al. In 2017, where they had different trial cafeterias where they increased the share of veggie meals from 25% to 50%, and in return, the sales of veggie meals in those cafeterias increased from 40% overall to 78%, while the overall profit of the cafeteria stayed more or less the same. My research group has also found that the people's exposure to meat substitutes was the most important predictor of people's intention to reduce meat consumption, as well as also support policies for more stringent meat reduction. Another type of intervention that we can take is labeling and other information schemes. My research group found there that the presence of a CO2 label on food products can strengthen individuals' attitudes and behavior change intentions towards reducing their livestock product intake. And also changes in decision infrastructures, which are also known as nudging interventions, can reduce the dampening feedback of habitual choices, so choices we make without really thinking about them. For example, this can be done by physically reorganizing where products are placed and placing, for example, plant-based products more prominently in supermarkets or in public canteens. During the accelerating phase, a very important mechanism also here is social contagion. So this can happen by changing social norms and behavioral norms towards a more diversified protein intake. An example of such a social contagion event is the participation in the UK in the campaign, in the Veganuary campaign, which was around 1,500 people in, I think, 2015, and changed to over 500,000 of participants in 2022. Another important mechanism, as previously mentioned, are demonstration effects. So the actual experience of alternatives to livestock-based products can increase the support also for more plant-based diets. And lastly, network effects are very important. So different members of a population must coordinate on a new technology suite to get a superior payoff from it. This essentially means, for example, that to produce meat substitutes, different actors need to coordinate to make the production of meat substitutes equally as efficient as now is the production and processing of livestock-based products. An example outside of the food system for once would also be like how electric vehicles and charging stations had to be coordinated to get a superior payoff eventually that is competitive with traditional cars and gas stations. Exactly. So a last mechanism, sorry, that I forgot about this one, that I wanted to point out is also economies of scale. This essentially means that the more meat substitutes are produced, the more efficiently they can also be produced. And this lowers the cost of the individual unit.
Yeah, so we heard a lot about different policy interventions and about technological and behavioral change. But so can you say a little bit more about how those different interventions have to work together?
Absolutely. The research group I work for developed this figure that you can see now. that is a suggestion that tries to illustrate how strategic policy packaging and sequencing in combination with those tech behavior interactions can overcome barriers and enable transformative policy change. Let me walk you through the figure quickly. At T1, the introduction of a substitution-oriented policy is suggested. These policies are policies usually that focus on tech change, such as public investments into research and development of, say, to stick with the example of alternative proteins or meat substitutes. It is suggested to firstly have such a substitution-oriented policy, as these usually face less political opposition. Then at T2, the introduction of that substitution-oriented policy enables, to stick with the example, the development of new and tastier meat substitutes, which then in turn encourages people to take up more plant-based diets. At T3, these plant-based diets are taken up by more and more people and slowly become a social norm, thereby increasing the public support and also create novel coalitions or interest groups around plant-based diets, which can then at T4 politically lobby for more stringent and more sufficiency-oriented measures. These sufficiency-oriented measures are measures aimed at reducing livestock production and consumption. This can be, for example, meat taxation or pushing for true cost policies. So we can really see in this loop how first substitution-oriented policies are introduced that then lead to certain tech and behavior change, novel coalitions form, and then these feed back into a political process, which then can enable more stringent food policy at T5. But yeah, now I've talked a lot about policy and top-down kind of interventions. But Franzi, do you think there's also a bottom-up way to structure this transformation and to make dietary shift possible?
Yeah, of course. So, in the end, it all comes down to individuals and agents who interact and who get into action to lead the transformation and support the transformation. And human agency is also a key determinant to lead to positive tipping processes towards sustainability. And different studies have shown that between 3.5 and 30% of very committed individuals within a population are actually enough to tip the entire society. And so we decided to take a closer look at this role of human agency and positive tipping points. And we have developed this framework that is quite rich, so I'll also walk you through it in detail. Maybe first of all, what is human agency? It's defined as the capacity of an individual or of collective actors to change the course of events and to make purposeful choices. And how we have defined it, we also include a sense of responsibility, of awareness, a feeling of control, self-efficacy, the feeling of urgency to act, and also the ability to influence others. This is how we have defined agency. Again, there is the feeling of individual agency and also the feeling of collective agency. And as you can see here in this framework, we have integrated that in the what you hopefully know well by now, and that was very nicely introduced by Sol, the social tipping framework in human and social systems. So you see the status quo, you see here the point of action and action, and we have the choice between do we achieve social change or not. And the question we were asking is, what is the role of agency within all of that? And what is really important here are the drivers or determinants of individual or collective agency, or the feeling of individual and collective agency. So we start with intrapersonal factors that refers to personality traits, for example, but also to emotions that either increase or decrease the feeling of agency. Then very important is the social environment, and that refers to the information you receive or don't receive. Also education plays a role, the culture you live in, and the peer group, of course, and as well socioeconomic status and social norms. And then also really important is the third determinant here in the bottom, which are the structural factors, and they refer to laws or infrastructure, but also institutions or power structures. And so you see here from this feeling of individual or collective agency that is influenced by these three factors, we either act or don't act. And action can also take different forms. And we look here, of course, action meant in terms of social movement, social change, climate activism, etc., everything that leads us towards sustainability. And action can be individual, so that can mean, as we have seen already in the examples, personal dietary change, but it can also be collective action, so organize in a climate movement, organize climate strikes, but it can also mean that we have the goal to influence laws, for example. So you see here also there's feedback loops from action, so the action can influence structural factors and lead to legislative changes. It can also lead to new social norms. Then we have also the box of proxy agency within that. So that's just as a reference to, if you don't want to act yourself, you can also vote, or you can pay an organization to lobby for your interests. And it's maybe not that easy as it sounds here, because there are also positive and negative or dampening and accelerating feedbacks. And that could be, for example, your peers who really encourage you to take action and go with you to protests. But it could also be a dampening feedback, for example, a feeling of being overwhelmed by the climate crisis and not being able to actually have an impact on it. Or it can be a mistrust in science, or a feeling of a lack of control. And maybe this was a little bit abstract now, and we're here talking about food systems. So let's apply that to a very concrete case study. And we have found a really nice case study, and that is called ACKA, which is a German NGO that produces programs for children and does school gardening with kids. So kids, they help, or they design programs for kids to garden in school and to learn about farming, but also about healthy eating. And it's running for 10 years now. So you can see here in dark green from 2014 till today, it's really growing exponentially. And it has shown, now they have done surveys and interviews, and it has shown that it increases the feeling of agency, of individual and collective agency, both with children, but also with teachers. And so let's look at this closer. We have here the feeling of agency, and that is influenced by the different factors. So the social environment here includes information, which means all the knowledge that the children get through this academy schooling program about plants and farming and climate and healthy eating. It also is connected, of course, to the culture. So is gardening part of the school curricula, or is it not? So does the society see this as actually something important or not? And it's influenced, of course, by social norms. So the healthy eating habits have to be seen as something that you want to achieve and something that is important. Structural factors here is, first of all, the school adopts the ACKA program, and that as part of the school curriculum, the school has the possibility to take part in these school gardening programs. Then, as I said, the surveys and interviews have shown that children have an increased self-efficacy because they can decide what they want to grow, and they can see directly how they plant seeds and how the plant is growing. That is a really positive feeling for the kids that they can actually make a change. The same accounts for the collective agency. So kids can collectively decide which vegetables they want to plant in their veggie plots. And that leads then finally also, that has been shown with surveys and interviews, to dietary change towards more veggies. And as far as they have done the interviews so far, parents and teachers report that up to 40% of the kids are now actually eating more vegetables. And so I think that's a really nice example that a feeling of agency can really accelerate and improve action, and that if we continue with this program, it might really lead to a tipping point. And ACKA actually has the plan to, by 2030, reach every single child within Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And now you have received a lot of information from us. I assume that you might have some questions as well. And with that, I hand over back to Tom for Q&A.
Thank you, Franzi and Sol, for a whistle-stop stop tour of what is a vast and complex system that ultimately, you know, we all absolutely depend on for our health and our well-being and our lives. So yeah, we'll move straight into a Q&A, and there's a huge number of topics there that I hope you're preparing interesting questions on. So I have one very quick one to begin with from Giuseppe Del Mestri. Sol, what do you mean by sufficiency-oriented policies?
Yeah, very good question. Sorry, I didn't explain this more in detail. So a sufficient-oriented policy is a policy that actually aims to reduce a certain type of behavior, now in our case, or in the dietary shift case, to reduce the intake of livestock-based products. Whereas we have this whole framework of sufficiency, substitution, and efficiency. So sufficiency means actually reducing, then substitution means replacing one product by another. So replacing meat by meat substitutes, for example. And efficiency means just making the current processes more efficient, or maybe a little bit better. That would mean, like, for example, improving animal welfare on livestock farms, but not actually aiming at reducing the total numbers of animals there. Does that make it clear?
I hope so. Giuseppe, do comment if you'd like more clarification. Here's a great question for both of you from Yared Tesema. How does food substitution or dietary shifting help address issues of food insecurity and malnutrition? So we typically think about this as something that applies in the kind of in industrialized societies, but does this play a role in the wider sustainable development goals?
Shall I start and then you add, Sol? So thanks for raising that question. And of course, it's the classic question. And I think it's really important, again, to reiterate that a lot of this dietary change and meat consumption reduction refers to global north, as you said, Tom. Specifically here, we have a massive overconsumption of livestock products, and with that already negative health impacts. And in the global south, we are very aware, and we should have mentioned that again in this talk as well. Livestock production can actually, or meat consumption can actually be really important for health, and livestock production can be important for livelihoods. So you have to be very careful. So thanks for mentioning that the meat reduction refers mostly to the global north. However, we can really see that in countries like China or India, more and more Western diets are adopted now, and immediately the obesity rates are increasing. So I think this might become a global issue. But again, it's important to notice that in some poorer countries, it's still very important to eat meat and to have livestock.
Unless Sol wants to come in, perhaps we can go sort of segue straight into Neve Robertson's question and look at the other side of this. So many of these meat substitute products that are being promoted in the global north are highly processed protein alternatives. Is there discussion of the health implications of promoting those foods, and yeah, how do we consider how the sort of health and environmental impacts interact?
Yeah, I can start on this one. I think it's a very important question, and one that I frequently struggle with as well, because obviously the most optimal choice would be to directly switch to just eating more leguminous plants and just more like less processed and raw foods that have the same or similar nutritional values to livestock alternatives. But we've just repeatedly found that these partially highly processed protein alternatives, meat substitute that mimic taste and flavor of meat, really do help to change behavior, because they have they fulfill different factors. For example, exactly, you want something that tastes like meat, and you maybe not be ready to switch directly to something that's completely different or to give up on eating meat. So you look for something that's quite similar. So this can actually help people to try and shift. And what is more also, there's also a lot of research being done on meat substitutes for them to become less less unhealthy in their highly processed nature. So I think that's also important to point out. And then lastly, yeah, I mean, a lot of people also lack the knowledge and maybe also the time in our fast-moving society to prepare raw products. So kind of giving them an opportunity or an easy way to switch to more plant-based diets is just a very efficient route to reach our goal of increasing plant-based diets, as Franziska mentioned, especially in the global north. But yeah, feel free, Franziska and also Tom, to add to that, because I think it's a very important question that we should be discussing.
Is there anything you'd like to add there, Franziska?
No, that was well answered.
Great. Yeah, it's certainly something that I've thought about a lot, and I know when I first started experimenting with sort of processed meat alternatives, I definitely ate a lot more things like corn nuggets than I would otherwise have done. So yeah, I think it's a really important question. There's a couple of questions coming in on regenerative agriculture, which, if you don't mind, I'll take quickly. So there's one from Yoram Gicheru: can soil and water conservation be said to be regenerative agriculture? And from Giuseppe Dalmestri again: does regenerative agriculture need more labor input? I'll think about both of those together a little bit, and I was kind of deliberately taking a very broad and fuzzy definition of what is regenerative agricultural activity, because that can mean very different things in different contexts. But really, I'm thinking about anything that aims to boost soil health or and biodiversity or ecosystem service provision, and emphasizes ecological functions rather than sort of synthetic inputs. So in that context, there are some interventions which can integrate really well with the kind of prevailing industrial system. So things like mycorrhizal inoculations and microbial inoculations for soils are already being developed by people, the institutions we would think of as really the kind of the perpetuators of the status quo, the sort of the Bayers and Monsantos of this world. Those can be used immediately by conventional farmers and already have significant impacts on soil health without changing really input costs. You're sort of substituting one input for another and without changing labor costs. But certainly, any activities that aim to boost soil health or conserve soils, improve soil moisture retention, and those things would be considered regenerative agricultural activity. I think the question of whether these need more labor input there's a kind of two different tacks on this question. In some cases, they may do, and I think all of this, has to be considered in terms of the balance sheet of the farmer, right? So many what are considered regenerative practices might reduce other input costs. So you're reducing fertilizer costs or tillage costs or fuel costs and so on. Diversification, I think, does always carry a kind of labor cost. So bringing a more complex, complexification of what have become incredibly simple farming environments probably does take more labor. But perhaps you can put some of that those economic savings into employing more people. And I think there's certainly a perspective that says that we have very rapid rural depopulation or a huge lack of rural employment in many parts of the world, and there's nothing inherently wrong with bringing more people back into the land if they're in good jobs and highly valued jobs. And I would like to see us valuing our food system more. So I don't think sort of intrinsically thinking about more labor is necessarily a bad thing. Of course, it has to be good quality work, but it has to make economic sense. Do we have any more questions in the Q&A? From Kai Greenlees: has there been any discussion about ethical considerations with intervening in social tipping processes, either in the food system or anywhere else, connected to ideas like unintended consequences or ramifications for agency? Who would like to tackle that?
I can maybe start. So again, the kind of the label positive tipping point. We mentioned that and we talk a little bit about that in the report. So thanks for pointing that out, is of course normative, right? So we have in the report defined that positive means towards a sustainable future, towards a carbon neutral future that is inclusive. Regarding the food system, the goals that we have set are a healthy food system that is nature positive or is environmental sustainable and inclusive. And so, of course, yeah, maybe this is important to say here that positive is defined, and other people might, like if you ask Monsanto, they might see positive as different as we define it here. Any additions, Sol?
No, actually, I don't think so. I think it's just to point out, I don't remember exactly which section, but there's also a section on social justice, right, in the Global Tipping Points report. So it's not my expertise, but there will be for sure more information there to read up on. And
yeah, and I
also,
would, sorry.
Go
Sorry,
ahead, no worries.
No, I would add that I think, this is absolutely essential to think about, and it's something that we're at maybe earlier stages of thinking about than we should be. But I think, in the food systems context, that earlier example of the Green Revolution is a really interesting one, right? Because it has like very, very much an intentional effort to transform the food system, but from very early on driven by and captured by sort of particular kinds of actors with particular interests. So, industrial and, but essentially kind of incredibly corporate and capitalist actors that accrue most of the benefit of that transformation. And of course, the initial goal is to provide food security, especially in that post-war environment. But there are really significant unintended consequences there that have huge ramifications for people. I think the other really important kind of ethical consideration here is that when we're trying to replace one system with another, of course there are actors within the system we're trying to replace who need safety nets or who need, who we really need to give consideration to. So, there are billions of people in the world who earn a living from livestock production currently. If we are trying to substantially reduce the amount of livestock production, we really need to think about what matters to those farmers, what kinds of systems they can transition to that give them the benefits and the livelihoods that they aspire to. So the flood of questions is slowing a little bit, which I think means this is a good time to jump into the kind of final activity that we've planned. So having thought about ideas of agency, we would really like to challenge you in a little experiment to think about kind of our own individual agency as consumers and part of this system. So with that, I'll hand back to Franziska, who's going to explain what we'd like you to do.
Yes, thanks, Tom. So you have heard now a lot from us. You got a lot of input. Thanks also for your questions. But as we talk about human agency, we thought we would like to invite you to explore a little bit your sphere of human agency in the food system transformation topic. And we want to hear from you about how you could think you can contribute to it. And for that, we prepared a question. And the question is, where do you want to be a seed for change? I think Carol will put it in the chat, so you will remember that. Where do you want to be a seed for change? And we will put you now in breakout groups of 5 people for the next 10-12 minutes. And this will give you a chance to exchange around this question. But don't worry, this is really meant as a reflection space for you to reflect on the topic after everything you heard in this talk. You absolutely don't have to report back. You don't have to write down anything. This is really a space for you to exchange. Yeah, I hope you enjoy this little experiment, and we will bring you back after 10-12 minutes.
Brilliant.
Welcome back, everyone. So I think you want to say a few closing words, right?
Yeah, I just actually wanted to ask you about your experience of these breakout rooms, and maybe because we're still a few people, so I think it's probably not enough time for everyone to verbally tell us about their experience, but maybe you can just write one word in the chat that summarizes your experience that you just had, talking about where you want to be a seed for change. That would be great.
Yeah, and other than that, we hope you enjoyed our little experiment. And yeah, we thank you for joining this webinar. And yeah, I guess there will be upcoming next webinars. I don't know, Caro, if you want to advertise already any upcoming meetings, or otherwise it will be shown on the website. Yeah, I think we would close then from our side, right? And thank you. Our next event will happen on June 19. Thanks, Carol.
Brilliant. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, Cara, do you have any final announcements, or is this?
Yeah, this was it. Please visit our webpage regularly. We also have some events planned for fall already on uncertainties and definitions of tipping points, maybe becoming more like sciencey, nerdy again. But yeah, please stay tuned and we will continue this series. And thanks so much for Tom, Sol, and Francie for taking the time and guiding us through this today. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you all. It was great to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you from my side for this opportunity as well. And have a great day as well.